The Crypto Markets Update is brought to you by KuCoin, the best place to find the next crypto gem. Taking a look at the NFT marketplace, NFT creators have earned $1.8 billion in royalties to date, according to a Galaxy Digital report. And joining us with more is Galaxy Digital Research Associate Salmaan Qadir. Welcome, Salmaan, to the show. So, interesting report here. I had a look through earlier. Maybe we could start off by explaining how these royalties work.
Yeah, sure. Basically, they are a social norm enforced by marketplaces like OpenSea. It's not really possible to program royalties at the smart contract level. So what these marketplaces do is a seller will set a royalty when they initially put their collection on the platform, whether it's 2.5 all the way up to 10%. And as these royalties are traded on secondary marketplaces, the OpenSea will collect all of those royalty fees on each sale on behalf of the seller, and in regular intervals of around 2 to 4 weeks, they will then disperse these royalties back to the creator, to whichever wallet they specify.
Mm-hmm. And we have some charts on the average royalty percentage on OpenSea. Are many creators benefiting from these royalties, or is it a minority of projects?
It's a great question, and it comes down to what time scale you're looking at. If you were to put out a collection at the beginning of the NFT bull market, and a great example of this is Bored Ape Yacht Club, they only made a couple million from the primary sale, and they went on to make around $50 million in royalties over the course of the bull market. But if you inverse that, if you were to put out a collection much later in the cycle, it's likely that you would have generated a lot of hype and made most of your money off the primary sale. And then as the market kind of cooled down, you would have made a small amount. And another example of this is Meebits, which Yuga Labs acquired from Larva Labs. Very big collection, top 10 for most of the NFT space's history. And I think they turned on royalties this past July and generated about a couple $100,000 on it, which is just an extremely small number compared to how big the collection is.
So Salmaan, you see basically the royalty market is dwindling, actually, right? Is that the correct assumption to make with all of this? And also that $1.8 billion that you see as happening, that's potentially unrealized. That's dollar amounts at the time of the transaction, but we don't know whether or not people actually cashed out and converted it into fiat, or if they held and cried as the price collapsed. Correct?
Yes, that's correct. The 1.8 billion measures the USD value at the transaction time. And so, yeah, there's no way to know exactly how much money they could have potentially cashed out in fiat terms. As for the first part of your question, I would say there's certainly a much more heated debate around whether royalties are going to be here for the long term, certainly because they're so driven by market volume and velocity of the NFT space in general. Not many people are making tons of money from royalties. But I think the question we're asking is more about, in the long term, in 5 or 10 years, will this still be a key value proposition about NFTs? And I think that's why this question is so interesting.
What I also found interesting out of your report are the differences between the NFT ecosystems in different blockchains. So, for instance, Magic Eden's dominance as an NFT marketplace in the Solana ecosystem has wavered since the introduction of zero royalty marketplaces. Maybe you can explain that here.
Yeah, and so what this chart is showing is kind of Magic Eden's dominance, and I often consider and compare Magic Eden to OpenSea in terms of how much market share they have over NFT trading volume in Solana. Briefly, there was a period of time where HadeSwap and Hyperspace and challengers who enforced no royalties, and so they basically said, we're not interested in this social norm, we just want to acquire users and make NFT trading cheaper. People were sort of resonating with that, and so Magic Eden kind of did an about face. On the one hand, in September, they were pushing hard on royalties, and they wanted to enforce it with things like MetaShield and other innovations. They saw people weren't really responding to that, and so they turned off royalties, which is why you see the dramatic kind of trough, and then it increases back to their original levels. And this wasn't necessarily seen on the Ethereum side.
Yeah, so we see on the Ethereum side, OpenSea is still the dominant NFT marketplace in the Ethereum ecosystem, despite the emergence of zero royalty marketplaces there. So why are we seeing this difference?
There's a few reasons. I think ultimately the user base on Solana it tends to be different from the user base on Ethereum. And what I mean by that is on Solana, the NFTs are obviously tend to be worth less money and tends to attract a mercenary type of trader that wants to flip, and they might be doing more volume. Ethereum, on the other hand, is home to most of the most valuable NFTs in the space, whether it's a Punk or Fidenza or Bored Ape. And certainly a lot of these holders, especially on the generative art side, tend to just buy and hold and store value in these NFTs. And I think Tyler Hobbs said it best when he stated that the serious artists and collectors are on Ethereum. And so this ecosystem might not be as knee-jerk to royalty enforcement as the user base on something like Solana.
Yeah, along those lines, I mean, we're starting to say, last week we had Paul Brody from E&Y talk about how the Ethereum killers are going to be zombies. That these other layer ones, the Solanas of the world, might be in trouble down the road. So this actually speak well for OpenSea. Is this sort of like the future of OpenSea might actually be pretty bright if you have an Ethereum-based exchange at a time when Ethereum is growing, or do you see any potential threat to OpenSea within the Ethereum blockchain?
Yeah, it is the ultimate question, I think, is what is this going to look like in a few years? Will we kind of revert back to Ethereum where everything started, or will these challengers kind of figure out and work through these growing pains? It's hard for me to say definitively which way it'll go, but I am skeptical of the notion that these alt layer ones, so to speak, like your Solanas of the world, aren't going to come back in prominence over time, just because there's so much more innovation that can happen when you're rebuilding an entire ecosystem and a blockchain from first principles. You don't necessarily have all the tech debt that something like an Ethereum has. And even on the innovation side of Ethereum, if you're just looking at layer twos, for instance, Immutable X recently did more volume than Solana, and it was the number 2 NFT sort of vector in terms of volume traded on the day. But that doesn't really have much to do with Ethereum other than it settles to Ethereum. That's all innovation happening at the layer 2 level. There's a lot of challenges with that blockchain, Ethereum that is, when usage goes up and when trading volumes are up and gas fees are high. It's unclear that they've really solved anything. I think they're benefiting mostly from cooler market.
And one last question I have for you, Salmaan, is of the royalties, what percentage is actually going to creators compared to the NFT markets and, other intermediaries? Right.
It's traditionally, an OpenSea, for instance, will take a 2.5% service fee, and that goes straight to them. If you're using an AMM like SudoSwap, that fee is only 0.5%. So it depends what avenue one is trading on. But OpenSea, and we'll just stick with them because they tend to have the most trade volume. You can set a royalty as a creator anywhere from 0% all the way up to 10%. So it varies. I think over the last year during the bull market, we saw royalties creep up from 2.5% being kind of the standard, which was set initially by Yuga Labs. And then Azuki's and CloneX's kind of came out and then went up to 5%. Other side was 5%. And then it crept up even more, where DGods on the Solana side was enforcing 10% royalties, and Goblin Town was enforcing 7.5%. So we've seen quite the spectrum, and it varies.